Let me start by saying that Peter Terry was addicted to heroin. We were friends in college, and continued to be after I graduated. Notice that I said I. He dropped out after 2 years of barely cutting it. After I moved out of the dorm and into a small apartment, I didn't see Peter as much. We would talk online every now and then. There was a period where he wasn't online for about 5 weeks straight. I wasn't worried. He was a pretty notorious flake and drug addict, so I assumed he just stopped caring. Then one night I saw him log on. Before I could initiate a conversation, he sent me a message. "David, man, we need to talk." That was when he told me about the no-end house. It got that name because no one had ever reached the final exit. The rules were pretty simple and cliche. Reach the final room of the building and win $500. There were 9 rooms in all. The house was located outside the city, roughly 4 miles from my house. Apparently, Peter tried and failed. He was on heroin, and who knows what the fuck. Addict. So I figured the drugs got the best of him, and he wigged out at a paper ghost. He told me it would be too much for anybody, that it was unnatural. I didn't believe him. I told him I would check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 sounded too good to be true. I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about this building. Have you ever seen or read something that shouldn't be scary, but for some reason, a chill crawls up your spine? I walked towards the building, and the feeling of uneasiness only as I opened the front door. My heart slowed, and I let a relieved sigh leave me as I entered. The room looked like a normal hotel room that was decorated for Halloween or something. A sign was posted in the place of a worker. It read, "Room 1, this way. 8 more, follow. Reach the end and you win." I chuckled and made my way to the first door. The first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle of a Kmart. The first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle of a Kmart, complete with sheet ghosts and animatronic zombies, and gave a static growl when you passed by. At the far end was an exit. It was the only door besides the one I entered through. I brushed through the fake spider webs and headed to the second door. I was greeted by a fog as I opened the door to room 2. The room definitely upped the ante in terms of technology. Not only was there a fog machine, but a bat hanging from the ceiling, a few in a circle, scary. They seemed to have a Halloween soundtrack that would find in its 99-cent store on loop sometimes in the room. I didn't see a stereo, but I guessed they must have a PA system. I stepped over the few toy rats, then wheeled around and walked with a puffed chest across the next area. I reached for the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I did not want to open that door. A feeling of dread hit me so hard I could barely even think. Logic overtook me after a few terrified moments, and I shook it off and entered the next room. Room 3 is where things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a normal room. There was a chair in the middle of the wood-paneled floor. A single lamp in the corner did a poor job of lighting the area. casting a few shadows across the floor and walls. That was the problem. Shadows, as in plural. With the exception of the chairs, there were others. I had barely walked in the room, and I was already terrified. It was at the moment that I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even think, as I tried to automatically open the door I'd came through. It was locked from the other side. This set me off. Someone was locking the doors as I proceeded. There was no way out. I would have heard them. Was it a mechanical lock that sets automatically? Maybe. But I was really scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair's shadow remained, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk. I used to hallucinate when I was a kid, so I wrote off the shadows as a figment of my imagination. I began to feel as I made it to the halfway point of the room. I looked down as I took my steps, and that's when I saw it. Or didn't see it. My shadows weren't there. I didn't have time to scream. I ran as fast as I could to the other door, flung myself, without even thinking, into the room beyond. The fourth room seemed to be the most disturbing. As I closed the door, all lights seemed to be sucked out and put back into the previous room. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark. It never has been. But I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I held my hand in front of my face, as if I didn't know what I was doing. I would never have been able to tell. Darkness doesn't describe it. I couldn't hear anything. It was dead silence. When you're in a soundproof room, you can still hear yourself breathing. You can hear yourself being alive. I couldn't. I began to stumble forward after a few minutes. My repeatedly beating heart, the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. Wasn't even sure there was one this time. The silence was then broken by a loud hum. I felt something behind me. I spun around wildly, but could barely even see my nose. I knew it was there, though. Regardless of how dark it was, I knew something was there. The hum grew louder and closer. It seemed to surround me, but I knew whatever it was in front of me, itching closer. It took a step back. I had felt that kind of fear. I can't really describe true fear. I wasn't even scared. I was going to die. I was scared of whatever the alternative was. I was afraid of whatever this thing had in store for me. Then the lights flashed for a second and I saw it. Nothing. I saw nothing. And I know I saw nothing there. The room was again plunged into darkness and the hum began. A wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't hear this goddamn sound one more second. I ran backwards, away from the noise, and fumbled for the door handle. I turned and fell into room 5. Before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I'm not a drug addict. I have no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis short of childish hallucinations that I mentioned earlier. And those were only when I was really tired and just waking up. I entered the no-end house with a clear mind. After falling from the previous room, my view of room 5 was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me. It simply surprised me. Trees had grown in the room and towered above my head. The ceiling in this room was taller than the others, which made me think that I was in the center of the house. I got up off the floor, dusted myself off, and took a look around. It was definitely the biggest room of them all. I couldn't even see the door from where I was. Various brush and trees were blocking it. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were gonna get scarier, but this was a paradise compared to the last one. I also assumed whatever was in the fourth room stayed back there. I was incredibly wrong. As I made my way deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would hear if they were in the forest, chirping birds and occasional flock of birds. Birds seemed to be the only company in this room. That was the thing that bothered me the most. I heard bugs and other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the other side, when I first walked, I kept walking, hoping that the next tree I passed would reveal a door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a mosquito fly onto my arm. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt about 10 more land on my skin at the different places. I felt them crawl up and down my arms and legs, and a few made their way across my face. I flailed wildly to get them all off, but I couldn't. They just kept crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream, more of a whimper. To be honest, I didn't see a single bug. Not one bug was on me, but I could feel them crawling. I heard them fly by my face, sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially the ones I couldn't see or touch. But these bugs could touch me. They were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit. So I just crawled, my skin rattling with the presence of these phantom bugs. I grabbed the nearest tree and propped myself up, mindlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from crawling and dealing with whatever it was that was on me. I took a few shaky steps to the door, grabbing each tree and away for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it. The low hum from before, it was coming from the next room, and it was deeper. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. As I placed my hand on the doorknob, the bugs were completely gone, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I knew that if I let go, the bugs would return, and there was no way I would make it back to the room floor. I just stood there, my head pressed against the door, marked 6 in my hand, shakingly grasping the knob. The hum was so loud I couldn't even pretend to hear myself think. There was nothing I could do but move on. Room 6 was hell. I closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut and my ears ringing. The hum was surrounding me. As the door clicked into place, the hum was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise, and the door had shut. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to room 3, the same chair and lamp, but with the correct amount of shadows this time. The only real difference was there was no exit door, and the one I thought I came in was gone. As I said before, I had no previous issues of mental illness, nor did I do drugs. But at that moment, I fell into what I know now as insanity. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. At first, I scratched softly. The wall was tough, but I knew the door was there somewhere. I just knew it was. I scratched there, where the doorknob was. I crawled at the wall frequently with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood. I fell silently to my knees. The only sound in the room was an incessant scratching against the wall. I knew it was there. The door was there. I knew it was there. I knew if I could just get past this wall. "Are you all right?" I jumped off the ground and spun in one motion. I leaned against the wall before me, and I saw what it was that spoke to me. To this day, I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl. She was wearing a soft, white dress that went down to her ankles. She had long blonde hair to the middle of her back and white skin with blue eyes. She was the most frightening thing I've ever seen, and I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. While I looked at her, I saw something else. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only larger than normal and covered with hair. He was naked from head to toe, but his head was not human, and his toes were hooves. It wasn't the devil, but at that moment it might as well have been. The form had the head of a ram and the snout of a wolf. It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl in front of me. They were the same form. I couldn't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same spot in the room, but it was like looking at separate dimensions. When I saw the girl, I saw the form, and when I saw the form, I saw the girl. I couldn't speak. I could barely even see. My mind was revolting against what it was attempting to process. I had been scared before in my life, but I had never been more scared than when I was trapped in room 4. But that was before room 6. I just stood there, staring at whatever it was that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped here with it. And then it spoke again. "David, you should have listened." When it spoke, I heard the words of a little girl, but the other form spoke through my mind in a voice that I would not attempt to describe. There was no other sound. The voice just kept repeating that sentence over and over in my mind, and I agree. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness, yet couldn't take my eyes off what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I had passed out, but the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side, my eyes wide open, and the form staring down at me, scurrying in front of me. Across the floor was one of the battery-powered rats from the second room. The house was toying with me, but for some reason, seeing that rat pulled my mind back from whatever depths I was headed, and I looked around the room. I was getting out of there. I was determined to get out of that house and live and never think about this place again. I knew this room was hell, and I wasn't ready to take up a residence. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for my kind of opening. The room wasn't that big, so it didn't take long to soak up the entire layout. The demon still taunted me, the voice growing louder, with the form stayed rooted where it stood. The I placed my hand on the floor, lifting myself up to all fours, and turned to scan the wall behind me. Then I saw something I couldn't believe. The form was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how it shouldn't have come. I felt it breathe on my back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. A large rectangle was scratched into the wood, with a small dent chipped away at the center of it. Right in the front of my eyes, I saw the large 7 it had I had mindlessly etched into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just behind the wall, where room 5 was a minute ago. I don't know how I had done it. Maybe it was just a state of mind at the time, but I had created the door. I knew I had. In my madness, I had scratched into the wall what I needed the most, an exit to the next room. Room 7 was closed. I knew the demon was right behind me, but for some reason, it couldn't touch me. I closed my eyes and placed both hands at the large 7 in front of me. I pushed as hard as I could. The demon was screaming in my ear. It told me I was never leaving. It told me that this was the end, but I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in the room 6 with him. I wasn't. I pushed and screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew I was going to push through the wall eventually. I clenched my eyes shut and screamed. The demon was gone. I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and was greeted by a room as it was when I entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't have time to will. I turned back to the 7 and jumped back slightly. What I saw was a door. It wasn't the one I was scratched in, but a regular door with a large 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob. I just stood there for a while, staring at the door. I couldn't stay in the room 6. I couldn't. But if this was the only 6, I could not imagine what was in store in 7. I must have stood there for an hour just staring at the 7. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened the door to room 7. I stumbled to the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed and I realized where I was. I was outside. Not outside the room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung. I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees and tried, but I couldn't. I was finally out of that hell. I didn't even care about the prize that was promised. I turned and saw that the door I just went through was the entrance. I walked to the car and drove home, thinking of how nice a shower sounded. As I pulled up to my house, I felt uneasy. The joy of leaving no-end house had faded, slowly building in my stomach. I shook it off from the house and made my way to the front door. I entered and immediately went up to my room. There was a bed and my cat, Bakersfield. He was the first living thing I had seen all night, and I reached to pet him. He hissed and swiped his hand at me. I recoiled in shock, as he had never acted like that. I thought, whatever, he's an old cat. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. I descended the stairs and turned into the family room. What I saw will be forever burned in my mind. However, My parents were lying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to their bodies. Their heads were placed on their chests facing me. The most unsettling part was their expression. They were smiling, as though they were happy to see me. I vomited and sobbed. There, in my family room, I didn't know what had happened. They didn't even live with me at the time. I was a mess. Then I saw it, a door that had never been seen before. A door with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood. I was still in the house. I was standing in my room, but I was in the room 7. The faces of my parents smiled weirdly as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be, but they looked exactly like them. The door, marked 8, was across the room, behind the mutilated bodies in front of me. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment I gave up. The smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me. Where I stood, I vomited again and nearly collapsed. Then the hum returned. It was louder than ever. It filled the house with shock and shook the room. The hum compelled me to walk. I began to walk slowly, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk, and the closer I got to my parents, the closer I came to suicide. The walls were shaking so hard and seemed as though they were going to crumble, but still, the smiling faces. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. It was now between the 2 bodies. And a few feet away from the door, the disembodied hands clawed their way across the carpet towards me, all while the faces continued to stare, nor terror washed over me. And I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't want the voices to match those of my parents. They began to open their mouths. Their hands were inches from my feet. And in a dash of desperation, I lunged toward the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. Room 8. I was done after what I had just experienced. Knew there wasn't anything else this fucking house could throw at me that I couldn't live through. There was nothing short of the fires of hell that I wasn't all ready for. Unfortunately, I underestimated the ability of no in-house. Unfortunately, things got more disturbing, more terrifying, and unspeakable in room 8. I still have trouble believing what I saw in room 8 alone. The room was a carbon copy of rooms 3, 6, but still, in the unusual empty chair was a man. After a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted the fact that the man was sitting in the chair, but it was me. Not someone who looked like me. It was David Williams. I walked closer. I had to get a better look at. Even though I was sure of it, he looked up at me, and I noticed tears in my eyes. Please, please, don't do it. Please don't hurt me. What? I asked. Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you. Yes, you are, he said. Now he was sobbing. You're going to hurt me, and I don't want you to. He sat in the chair with his legs up and began rocking back and forth. It was actually pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. Listen, who are you? I was now only a few feet away from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet, standing there talking to myself. I wasn't scared, but I would be soon. You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. If you want to leave, you're going to hurt me. Why are you saying this? Just calm down, alright? Let's try to figure this out. And then I saw it. That David was sitting down, wearing the same clothes as me, except with a small red patch on the shirt, embroidered with the number 9. You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. Don't, please. You're going to hurt me. My eyes didn't leave that small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. The first few doors were plain and simple, but after a while they got more and more ambiguous. 7 was scratched into the wall, but by my own hand, 8 was marked in blood above the body of my parents. But 9, this number was on a person, a living person. Worse still, it was a person that looked exactly like me, David. I had to ask. Yes, you're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me, he continued to sob and rock. He answered to David. He was right down to the voice. But that 9, I paced around for a few minutes while he sobbed in his chair. The room had no door, and similar to room 6, the door I came through was gone. For some reason, I assumed that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and floor and the chair, sticking my head underneath and seeing if anything was below. Unfortunately, there was, below the chair, a knife attached to the tag that read, "To David, from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read this tag was something sinister. I wanted to throw up, and the last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under the chair. The other David was still sitting, sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning into an attic of unanswered questions, like who put this here, and how did they get my name, not to mention the fact that as I knew it, on a cold wood floor, I also sat in the chair, sobbing in protest of having to hurt myself. It was all too much to process. The house and management had been playing with me this whole time. My thoughts, for some reason, turned to Peter and whether or not he got this far. If he did, if he met a doppelganger of himself, sobbing in this chair, rolling back and forth. I shook these thoughts out of my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair, and immediately the other David went quiet. "David," he said in my voice, "what do you think you're going to do?" I lifted myself from the ground and clenched the knife in my hand. "I'm going to get out of here." David was sitting in the chair. Though he was very calm now, he looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if he was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly, he got up from the chair and stood, facing me. It was uncanny. His height, and even the way he stood, matched mine. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand, and I gripped it tighter. I didn't know what I was planning on doing with it, but I had the feeling I was going to need it. Now his voice was slightly deeper than my own. "I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you." I didn't even respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I had mounted him and locked down, knife poised and ready. He looked up at me, terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. Then the hum returned, low and distant, though I felt it deep in my body. As I looked down at myself, the hum was getting louder, and I felt something inside me snap with one motion. I slammed a knife into his chest and ripped down. Blackness full on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I had experienced before. Up until this point, room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to what I was completely engulfed in. I wasn't even sure if I was falling. After a while, I felt weightless, covered in dark. Then a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed, and suicidal. The sight of my parents entered my mind. I knew it wasn't real, but I had seen it, and the mind has a terrible way of distorting reality. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what seemed like days. The final room, that's exactly what it was, the end. No one else had an end, and I had reached it. At that moment, I gave up. I knew I would be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I had lost all senses. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't hear anything. Sight was completely useless here. I searched for a taste in my mouth and found nothing. I felt disembodied and completely lost. I knew where I was. This was hell. Room 9 was hell. Then it opened. A light. One of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt the ground come up from below me, and I was standing. After a moment or two of gathering my thoughts and senses, I slowly walked towards the light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of the unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself back where I was standing. The lobby of No End House. It was exactly how I left it. Still empty, still discarded, with childish Halloween decorations. After everything that had happened that night, I was still wary of where I was. After a few minutes of normalcy, I looked around the place trying to find anything different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious, yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. Inside was a letter, again handwritten. David Williams, congratulations. You have made it to the end of No End House. Please accept this prize as a token of our achievement. Yours forever, management. With the letter was 5 $100 bills. I could not stop laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked out to my car and laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I pulled into my driveway. I laughed as I opened the front door to my house and laughed as I saw a small 10 etched into the wood.